Hello and welcome to my channel, Rhino here. Today I'm looking at a Frank Turek video in which he gives us 4 reasons why he thinks Christianity is true. It's a fairly short video, so obviously he's not going to go into a lot of detail, but also, being a short video, we'd expect him to bring out the very best, most compelling arguments or evidence in favor of Christianity, so let's see what he's got.
The reason that we believe Christianity is true is because the answer to 4 questions is yes.
I'm gonna go out on a limb here and guess that for at least a couple of these questions, the answer is really, we don't know, but Frank will find a way to make it look like the answer is a definitive yes.
How about the first question, does truth exist?
Depends on how we're defining truth, but generally I would agree that the answer to that question is yes. The definition I like is the Apologia definition. Truth is the extent to which a proposition conforms to reality as adjudicated by predictive power. With this definition of truth, all that needs to happen for truth to exist is for something to exist, and then by virtue of the fact that something exists in reality, it is therefore true that it exists and has the properties that it has. This has nothing to do with the existence of a god, and in fact, it covers it quite nicely. If God exists, then it is true that God exists, and that is a statement of truth. If, however, God does not exist, then it is not true that a god exists. The problem with God comes with the whole as adjudicated by predictive power part of the definition. It may be true that a god exists, but how do we test this hypothesis? Apologists are fond of making their God claims completely unfalsifiable, so any test, no matter what the results, ends up being seen as evidence for God.
Obviously, you hear people say all the time, there is no truth.
Yeah, obviously, you hear people say that all the time. Except the only time I've ever heard that stated is in hypothetical conversations put forth by apologists. I have literally never heard anyone make that statement that is not an apologist trying to convince you that there cannot be truth without God.
Or you got your truth, I got my truth, all truth is relative.
Usually statements like those ones are specifically about religion and spirituality, so those will come from people who hold beliefs such as the idea that God exists, and all religions are just a different way for us to connect with God. Now, obviously I don't hold to such beliefs, but my understanding is that their view of truth is not that whatever someone believes to be true is actually truth, it's more that if you find your way to God through Christianity, then good job, that's what works for you. It doesn't mean that Christianity is literally true, it's just true that you connect with God through it. And the same goes for all the other religions too, because obviously a being such as God would be above such petty things as getting mad that you worshipped it the wrong way. It'll connect with you no matter how you go about it. And quite frankly, this actually makes a whole lot more sense than an all-powerful, all-loving God who gets mad if you don't worship him just right and feels a compulsive need to control how and when you have sex.
When somebody says there is no truth, you ought to ask that person a question. You ought to say, is that true?
No, you should ask them for their definition of truth, because answering that statement with that question will almost always lead to misunderstandings based on the equivocation of the word truth, with the statement there is no truth likely using a definition of truth that is more related to something like ultimate transcendental truth, with the is that true question referring to whether or not the statement matches with reality. If there is no ultimate transcendental truth, then the statement there is no ultimate transcendental truth conforms to reality and thus is a true statement. But again, I've never actually heard anyone say that there is no truth except for apologists setting up an easy question to knock down like this.
Is it true that there's no truth? Because if it's true that there's no truth, the claim there is no truth can't be true, but it claims to be true. In other words, it's a self-defeating claim.
Yeah, like I said, your clever little word games here amount to nothing more than equivocation. Maybe if you actually hear someone say something like that, ask them what they mean by truth before getting all smug about how easy it was to show their claims to be self-defeating.
Of course there's truth. If there was no truth, an atheist couldn't be right that there was no God. So there is truth.
Well, at least he doesn't seem to be going the route of claiming that an atheist can't be right because there can't be truth without God, when in fact all that is needed for truth to exist is for anything to exist. But then what's the point of saying truth exists in a How We Know Christianity is True video if that's not where you're going with it? Is it just that it is possible for things to be true, therefore saying Christianity is true is possibly a true statement? 'Cause that's weak. Like, really weak.
Question number 2, does God exist?
I mean, I suppose Christianity can't be true if the answer to this is no, but really, depending on how you're defining God, the answer is either a definitive no or a definitive we don't know. Now, I would suggest that the Christian God fits into the definitive no category based on how internally inconsistent he is. I mean, we get the broad strokes of the vengeful God of the Old Testament not really fitting in with the loving God of the New Testament, but really, that is something that could be squared with a more general, less powerful God concept. If God is omniscient, then all the verses about him having regrets and not knowing things don't make sense. He regretted making humans. He regretted making Saul king. He didn't know where Adam and Eve were in the garden. He didn't know whether or not the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah was accurate. He didn't know who the princes of Moab who were staying with Balaam were. He didn't know what was in the Israelites' heart, and so made them wander in the desert for 40 years to test them and find out. And more. If God is omnipotent, then why were iron chariots a problem for an army that he was supporting? Why was Jesus unable to do mighty works in his hometown? Why was God unable to do what Jesus asked of him to keep the church completely unified as a sign that he was who he said he was? Such contradictions are not actually contradictions if you're willing to give up the omnis, but as long as the omnis are insisted upon, they demonstrate that the Christian God doesn't have them, and so the Christian God, as defined by most apologists, is in the definitive no does not exist category. Well, something more along the lines of a deistic God would fall into the we don't know category. Sure, I don't think a deistic God exists, but I can't prove that it doesn't like I just did with the Christian God.
There are several arguments for the existence of God. Let me just give you one. Even atheists today are admitting that space, matter, and time had a beginning out of nothing.
Not really. I mean, I'm sure you'll find some who agree with that, but anyone who is even remotely familiar with the current state of the study of cosmology will tell you that we don't know whether or not the universe had a beginning in the sense that we normally think about it. As such, any conclusions drawn from this erroneously asserted idea that matter, space, and time all began simultaneously from nothing will be tentative at best.
Well, think about this, friends. If space, matter, and time had a beginning out of nothing, whatever created space, matter, and time can't be made of space, matter, and time.
Maybe. Really, we don't know because we've never observed such an event, so to draw conclusions about how that event must have happened based on our intuitions is unlikely to get us to the right answer.
Now, when you think about a spaceless, timeless, immaterial, powerful, personal, intelligent cause,
I like how you're sneaking powerful, personal, and intelligent in there. Was there any justification for that, or are you just aware that a spaceless, timeless, immaterial cause is not enough to actually get you to a god, and so had to add on more properties in order to more specifically point towards your desired conclusion? Again, powerful seems intuitive, but if the total energy of the universe is zero, as some have hypothesized, then it would take zero energy input to cause the universe, and so powerful is not necessary. The extrapolation that gets us to personal has its roots in the version of this argument put forth by the 12th century Islamic philosopher Al-Ghazali, but most people today are probably more familiar with William Lane Craig's version. Essentially, if a cause is sufficient to produce an effect, then if the cause is there, the effect will be there too. The example he sometimes uses is that of water freezing. If the cause of water freezing is that the temperature is below 0 degrees Celsius, then if the temperature has always been below 0 degrees Celsius, then water cannot ever have begun to freeze, as it will always have been frozen. I assume that he would agree with the additional stipulations being applied here. It's not just the temperature, it's also the pressure and availability of nucleation points. Water under high pressure will have a lower freezing point, and supercooled water can be kept from freezing all the way down to negative 40 Celsius by keeping it super pure and not moving it. But I assume this is overlooked in the analogy for simplicity's sake more than anything else. This is then used to reason that there must have been a being with free will who is capable of making a decision to bring about the change that resulted in the universe. This is a rather large, unsubstantiated leap that does not work if one of these several models of the universe that don't have a beginning ends up being the correct model, and it might not even work for any of the other ones either. But even if I grant all of this is only at macro scales. Cause and effect don't work in the ways that we are familiar with at the quantum level. On macro scales, we know that event A causes event B, but on quantum scales, a causal relationship can have a superposition in which event A influences event B, and event B also influences event A, making causation a rather difficult thing to parse out. A decent, though still certainly flawed, analogy would be something like a predator-prey relationship. The size of the population of the prey animals will impact the size of the population of the predator animals, and vice versa, both population sizes being causally linked to the other with no clear first cause. It is a very complicated topic, but suffice it to say for now that the pre-Big Bang universe was a place where such quantum effects could have had a significant impact on the final outcome of the universe, meaning that our macro-scaled intuitions are insufficient when it comes to drawing conclusions about the causality of the early universe. And if we're sticking to the William Lane Craig reasoning to get to these conclusions, then we know that the creator has to be intelligent because of the fine-tuning of the universe. I believe he uses the physical constants as the main thrust of that argument, which is another unknown. We don't actually know why the constants are what they are, and we don't even know if it's possible for them to be any different. So to assume that an intelligence is needed to make them what they are is just that, an assumption. We don't have enough data to draw a conclusion. But on top of that, that's the part of the teleological argument that evolution deniers like Frank Turek here can't spend too much time thinking about, because the whole point of that aspect of the teleological argument is to make the point that the universe was designed in such a way as to make the evolution of life possible. So that's a bit of a catch-22 for young Earth creationists like Frank. So thus far we've got three properties of the cause of the universe that I might be willing to hypothetically grant, with the caveat that we acknowledge that we actually don't have enough data to reach these conclusions at this time, and three more that are just another layer of assumption added on top of the first three, which were already pretty assumptive to begin with. But yeah, it appeals to our intuition, I'll grant you that.
Who do you think of?
I think of William Lane Craig being condescending and smug about these things that he can't possibly have any way of knowing for sure. Oh, wait, God. I think of God. That's the answer you wanted, right?
God. Now, we don't know it's the Christian God at this point, but we know it's a theistic God, a being who's beyond the world, who created the world.
Why not a deistic God? A deistic God could have all of those properties. Personal is maybe debatable, but generally speaking, when we're using the word personal in this sense, it's more that the God has the property of personhood rather than is interested in a personal relationship with us, which, depending on which deist you ask, can include deistic gods.
The third question is, are miracles possible?
Aren't miracles definitionally impossible? So wouldn't the answer to this be no? If a miracle is an event that is possible, then there's nothing particularly special about miracles. So if a miracle is impossible, then the answer is no, they are not possible. But if they are possible, then they don't point to a god needing to suspend the laws of nature in order to perform them.
Obviously, Christianity can't be true if miracles are not possible.
No, I'd say the opposite is more likely true. If miracles are impossible, then a god who is able to perform them has to have a great deal of control over the inner workings of the universe itself. But if they are possible, then it's nothing particularly special and wouldn't necessarily require a god in order to perform. But then we end up at another catch-22. If miracles are definitionally impossible, then when looking at the case for the resurrection, literally any naturalistic explanation for the beginning of Christianity, no matter how far out it is, becomes infinitely more plausible than a resurrection actually happening. And that includes such wild hypotheses as the idea that Jesus was just an advanced alien who only appeared to have died, with his ascension being his final trip back up to his spaceship before leaving us. If we somehow found enough evidence about the event to exclude all possibilities except for aliens and a miracle, then aliens would still be more likely than a miracle because miracles are impossible while aliens are just incredibly improbable.
But the greatest miracle in the Bible has already occurred, and we have scientific evidence for it.
I don't care which miracle he's referring to, the answer is no, we do not have scientific evidence that anything miraculous happened.
What's that? I just mentioned it. The creation of the universe out of nothing.
See, there you go. I am only aware of one model of the universe that has it originating from nothing out of the dozens of models that are out there, and that model was put forth by a guy who is definitely an atheist. If the guy who developed the universe from nothing model doesn't think that a god was needed to kick it off, then what do you think is more likely here? That Frank Turek, a guy whose formal education is in administration and apologetics, found some fatal flaw in a cosmological model of the beginning of the universe? Or that the cosmologist who spent his entire life studying mathematics and physics developed a model that doesn't require a god? Is Krauss's model the right model? Probably not. We probably have not yet developed the correct model of the beginning of the universe, in whatever sense that we can say the universe had a beginning, but the point is that cosmologists, the people who spend their entire lives studying this exact thing, do not conclude that a god is needed. In fact, the most prestigious cosmologists are usually well known for their opposition to the idea that a god is needed to get the universe going. Now, which is more likely here? That only people who are hard-hearted atheists who oppose God out of obstinacy ever become cosmologists? Or that the intense study of cosmology over years of your life leads to the conclusion that a god is not a necessary part of the equation?
If Genesis 1:1 is true, every other verse in the Bible is at least possible.
Maybe, but there are some verses that, if they are true, they make other verses necessarily untrue. So if Genesis 1:1 is true, it is not true with respect to the God who did the creating being the Christian God.
Because if there's a being that can create the universe out of nothing, can he do whatever he wants inside the universe? If he can create the whole show out of nothing? Of course.
Not necessarily. Now, I'm sure the creative types in my audience will have similar stories to this, but there have been several times when I have made something, usually in my case it's some simple computer program, that once I'm done with it, I find that I have made things in a way that make future modifications a huge pain in the ass at minimum, and sometimes impossible without breaking the whole thing. So it stands to reason that a non-omniscient god, like the one depicted in the Bible, might have made a mistake or two with the universe that makes it hard, if not impossible, to perform certain actions within that universe.
He can resurrect Jesus from the dead, or walk on water, or part the Red Sea. He can do any of that.
Probably, but so could any non-Christian creator god by this logic. We're on reason number 3 of 4, and so far, even if I grant everything that you've said, all we have at this point is a god who created the universe and is capable of performing magic tricks if it so desires. That is compatible with basically any religion that has a god in the role of universe creator.
So the final question, the fourth question, which gets us all the way to the Christian God, is the New Testament reliable enough to show us that Jesus rose from the dead?
And there it is. This is why you had to concede that miracles are possible, thereby taking them away from being definite supernatural events. Because if they are impossible, then even if the New Testament is found to be 100% accurate at reporting events exactly as they happened, you can never actually conclude that Jesus rose from the dead because of supernatural intervention. That said, the answer to this question is unquestionably no. So I was wrong at the beginning when I guessed there'd be at least 2 maybes. I was giving Frank too much credit. It was 1 yes, 1 maybe, and 2 definite no's. With regards to the New Testament, the best case scenario is we have letters that were written 20 years after Jesus' death by a guy who'd never even claimed to have met Jesus when he was alive and never claimed to have seen him in anything other than a vision, many of which were him admonishing churches that he had founded for following other versions of Christianity that he disagreed with, followed by the first accounts of Jesus' actual life not being written down for another 20 or so years after that, after the stories were already in oral circulation by the early Christians. And we all know how well oral circulation works at preserving historical details. From the earliest writings, we don't even get a cause of death for Jesus, just that he died and was buried. Future Rhino cutting in, Paul does mention the cross a few times, so we actually do get a cause of death, but there are 0 details about it, and you'd think something as remarkable as a crucified criminal being given a proper tomb by a rich man would be worth mentioning at some point. The tomb doesn't show up until the later, completely anonymously authored accounts of Jesus' life. On top of that, the Gospels can't even agree on important details of Jesus' life. Was he crucified before or after Passover? Was Jesus' grandfather on Joseph's side named Heli or Jacob? Did Simon carry Jesus' cross, or did he carry it himself? Did he cleanse the temple at the beginning or end of his ministry? Did Joseph and Mary live in Bethlehem but had to flee to Egypt with Jesus when he was around 2 years old to wait for Herod to die, and then move to Nazareth instead of back to Bethlehem in order to avoid Herod's son Archelaus? Or did they come to Bethlehem as part of a census while Mary was pregnant, have the baby, and move back to Nazareth after all the religious rituals surrounding childbirth were done, having them in Bethlehem for no more than a couple months? How can we trust the Bible to accurately portray events that are known to be impossible if we can't even trust it to accurately portray the more mundane events of Jesus' life?
The reason we believe in Christianity is because an event occurred, the resurrection.
Okay, let's hypothetically grant this one as well. Maybe Jesus was just a normal apocalyptic preacher, something that was fairly common in first century Judea, but a God who likes to play jokes on people brought him back from the dead for a bit to see what would happen. There, I have now explained the resurrection in terms that do not definitively lead to Christianity, but would still be covered by your earlier arguments for a God's existence. Even if the resurrection is true, and even if I granted that a God would be necessary for such an event, it still doesn't get us to the Christian God. But I have to do a lot of hypothetical scenario granting before we even get to that point.
Now, I have to ask you this. Why would the Jewish writers of the New Testament, all were Jewish with the exception of Luke, why would they invent a resurrected Jesus?
Who says they invented it? They were Jews at a time when the Jews were expecting a Messiah. A figure showed up that they thought was the Messiah, who then died in a way that did not match with their messianic expectations. It would only take one of them to have a post-bereavement hallucination to get the rumor ball rolling and result in a bunch of people honestly believing it was true. I mean, a bunch of churches were started by Paul, a guy whose teachings were explicitly based on personal revelation, that is, visions. I'm having a hard time pinning down a number from reliable sources, but I'm seeing estimates of between 14 and 20 churches being started by Paul. And this is happening before any of the Gospels were even written. And he wasn't the only one starting churches. It's clear from his letters that there were other Christian sects that he opposed, which had different beliefs about Jesus. So we see evidence that early Christians already had beliefs that were quite different from sect to sect before we even see stories told of the actual life of Jesus. Is it really so hard to imagine that the gospel accounts were not the inventions of the authors, but rather the faithful retellings of stories that the authors were already familiar with? I mean, we know for sure that's what happened with Matthew and Luke, since so much of their material was just word-for-word copying of the earlier book of Mark. Is it really that much of a stretch to think that Mark was doing the same but with oral traditions? 40 years is plenty of time for the story to have gone from itinerant apocalyptic rabbi pissed off the Romans enough to get executed to what we have in the book of Mark. Luke and Matthew then add on their own version of the birth narrative, which were clearly competing traditions, and then John, being from a different sect entirely with different beliefs about Jesus, went out of his way to contradict some of the details from the earlier gospel accounts. No need for the authors themselves to have invented the stories, no need for scheming and lying disciples, just the retelling and embellishments of communal stories over time, as we know happens with all stories that are told that way.
Why would they say that a man who claimed to be God rose from the dead if it didn't happen?
Many reasons. Many of them possibly similar to the reasons other authors of other cultures wrote down stories about their gods dying and then rising from the dead. No, I am not proposing that Jesus was invented as a Jewish iteration of the rising and dying God motif, but the fact is that this was a motif that existed in the area at the time, so it was not unheard of. It is nowhere near as common as some would have you believe, but Jesus is definitely not unique in that regard. The mythologization of historical figures can be a rapid process. Just think of the cherry tree myth of George Washington. That first appeared a mere 7 years after his death, and was a firmly rooted part of American culture by the 1830s, just 30 years after Washington's death. And all of this despite there being a decent record of the story's invention. After all, the book it was first published in didn't include it until the 5th edition, and the author who invented it gave interviews in which he admitted to inventing it. The story remained a not insignificant part of American culture for nearly 200 years. Now, imagine a similar situation in first century Judea, where the majority of the population were not literate, and most stories of this type are told orally. Someone like Mason Weems, who is the guy who invented the cherry tree myth, might wonder at why the stories he hears of Jesus don't quite match up with his personal belief about Jesus, and so would adjust the details of the story to make for a better story in his opinion. Not with malicious intent or the intent of deception, but the Jesus I believe in would have behaved this way rather than that way, so obviously my version would be more likely to be true. And after 30 to 40 years of retelling, slight adjustments, and slight embellishments, we have the bare-bones Gospel of Mark. With the popularity of Mark, people crave more details. How was Jesus born? What did he do after he rose from the dead? What other deeds might he have done in his life? And when there is a demand for such details, that demand will inevitably be filled by the storytellers, with the details being slightly altered with each retelling, either for better audience reactions, to fill in perceived gaps or plot holes in other already circulating stories.
I've placed a weakness deep within the system, a flaw so small and powerful they will never find it. The reactor module, that's the key. That's the place I've laid my trap. It's well hidden and unstable. One blast to any part of it will destroy the entire station.
Or just from the fact that we, as humans, are largely incapable of repeating the exact same story the exact same way every time consistently from memory. By the time the Gospels were written, many people had already come to believe that Jesus had risen from the dead from nothing more than a report of a man who only claimed to have had visions of him. The Gospel authors were simply recording what people believed at the time they were writing.
They thought that would be blasphemy for a man to claim to be God.
Which is actually one of the ways we know that the Gospel of John can't be literally true. Jesus basically claimed flat out to be God in the temple at Jerusalem at the beginning of his ministry while driving the money changers out of the temple at whip point. The Jewish leaders had full authority to have him executed for blasphemy then and there, and had a quasi-military temple guard to back them up on that. The idea that he could have gotten away with that and then gone out and spread his message for at least 2 more years is just completely ludicrous.
And why would they invent a resurrected Jesus? They already thought they were God's chosen people. They had no motive to invent a resurrected Jesus.
Oh, come on, Frank. They were Jews living in first century Judea. The Jews of that time and place were looking for a coming Messiah who would save them from the Roman occupation and restore God's kingdom on earth. When their Messiah didn't pan out, at least one of them could quite plausibly have had a post-bereavement hallucination that convinced him that Jesus had risen from the dead, which caused them to rework their messianic ideas to be less earthly and more ethereal. In fact, one of the things that Paul was fighting hard against in his letters to the early churches were the early Christians who were trying to teach that, in order to follow Christ, one had to become a Jew, complete with eating kosher and being circumcised. Paul was interested in gaining Gentile converts, and knew that asking people to chop off parts of their penises to join his religion was going to be a major hindrance to that effort, and so he vehemently opposed these teachings. But the fact of the matter is that until about 85 CE, the Christians were largely seen as just another sect of Judaism. They were effectively kicked out of the synagogues around 85, with the addition of a benediction in the services that included a prayer where the Nazrim and the Minim be destroyed and blotted out from the Book of Life. The Nazrim were likely a sect of Messianic Jews that followed the teachings of John the Baptist, while the Minim were the Christians.
And certainly they could not have invented it in Jerusalem, where an empty tomb existed.
Allegedly. Remember, Mark is the first book where we have any mention of an empty tomb, and that was 30 to 40 years after Jesus' death. Even if there was a site that was being called the empty tomb of Jesus, how was anyone supposed to verify that there actually was a body in there at that point? If you brought me to an empty tomb today and then told me that 30 years ago there was a body in that tomb, but the fact that there's no body there now is proof that the person who was there came back from the dead, there is zero chance that I would believe you based on that evidence alone. An empty tomb is not evidence that someone came back to life in that tomb 30 years ago. But, of course, I don't have the good fortune that Frank has. He apparently believes that the Gospels were written by the eyewitnesses in opposition to the consensus opinion of historians, most of whom are believing Christians. I'm gonna stick with the consensus timeline, but Frank seems to be convinced that the people that the stories were written about were actually there as it happened, writing it down shortly afterwards, which still wouldn't be enough evidence to prove that Jesus resurrected, but it would at least be a little better.
In other words, ladies and gentlemen, the New Testament writers did not create the resurrection. The resurrection created the New Testament writers.
Or, as few as 2 independent hallucinations led to sincere believers who led to the New Testament writers.
There would be no New Testament if it wasn't for the resurrection.
No, there would be no New Testament if it weren't for the 4 or 5 ecumenical councils that decided which books were canon some 300 to 400 years after the fact. Or the New Testament would look drastically different. How many books were lost to history because canon was declared and so they just stopped being copied or were actively sought out and destroyed as heresies? There are many books that we know about purely from how they were quoted by the early church fathers who were publishing refutations of their claims. How many more were not quoted? The fact is that writing about Jesus and Christian theology was very common in the early days of the religions, and the writings were treasured. As so few of the population were literate, the letters to the churches were often read aloud during services, repeatedly, much as we do with scriptures today. And many of the letters and stories that were being read by the early Christians were ideas that did not even come close to ending up as part of the orthodoxy. Heretical ideas like Docetism that held that Jesus and Christ were two separate beings, with Christ being the divine God being and Jesus being the human. At the crucifixion, Christ left Jesus' body, causing Jesus to call out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Christ then hovered above the cross, laughing with glee at how the Romans thought they could hurt him but had been tricked into crucifying Jesus without him. Then there were the Ebionites, a sect that held views that would largely be agreed with today. Jesus was the one sacrifice that made all other sacrifices pointless, as Jesus covered the sins of humanity, negating the need for the other sacrifices. Where modern Christians would differ from the Ebionites is that they still held to the Jewish laws, some even going so far as to remain vegetarian, as the consumption of meat was seen as an act of sacrifice to a god or gods. Oh, yeah, and there's also the minor matter of adoptionism. Ebionites were adoptionists. Jesus was adopted by God at his baptism because he had successfully kept all the Jewish laws perfectly in his life. Echoes of this type of belief can actually be found in the Gospels themselves, perhaps nowhere more obvious than in the oldest manuscripts of Luke chapter 3, verse 22, where Jesus is baptized, the Holy Spirit descends on him in the form of a dove, and a voice from heaven calls out with the words, "Beloved Son, today I have begotten you." All this to say that there were plenty of books being written about Jesus that had plenty of different stories in them which Frank himself would call heretical, and yet we are just to trust the ones that are in the Bible because those are the ones that were officially canonized several hundred years after they were written, and the echoes of the alternate stories can often be found in the New Testament that we have today. So to just say, nah, they wouldn't have made up stories like that, as though there weren't dozens of sects of competing Christian groups with beliefs that were so radically different from each other that they would make a Southern Baptist look identical to a Roman Catholic by comparison, is just laughable.
Now, even if the New Testament never existed, Christianity would still be true.
I mean, if it were true, I would agree that that statement is true, but thus far you haven't given me any real reason to accept it as true.
Why? Because Christianity is based on an event, the resurrection. Do you realize there were thousands of Christians before a line in the New Testament was ever written?
Oh my God, Frank, how can you say that immediately after making it sound like the books were written so soon after the events that they couldn't possibly have suffered embellishment before being written? Do you not see how thousands of people passing stories back and forth orally with no written records is a perfect recipe for embellishment? How can you have missed that?
Why? Because an event occurred.
The event being that some charismatic guys started promising superstitious people eternal paradise if they joined up. It's not that complicated.
The resurrection.
No, there's still no evidence for that.
You have to have more faith to believe it didn't occur than it did.
That is a completely nonsensical statement. The resurrection is a claim, an extraordinary claim at that. In addition to that claim, there's the claim that the guy who resurrected really wants to meet me personally. In addition to that one, the guy who resurrected and really wants to meet me personally also has unlimited power. In other words, if he really did resurrect and really wants to meet me, he has the ability to do so without relying on subpar apologists fumbling through terrible arguments that don't even hold up to basic levels of scrutiny.
And if God exists, and he does, and can create the universe out of nothing, then he can certainly resurrect Jesus from the dead.
And if all of that is true, then he can certainly show up himself sometime so that he doesn't have to rely on extremely fallible people to try and convince non-believers. So much for the best arguments that he's got. If those were them, then no wonder I'm an atheist. That's it for this one. Today's comment of the day comes to us from Bengen, who says, "Mr. Rhino, please do not use the hey Google in your videos. I have a number of Google Assistant gear in my house, and you are activating them every time you use the wake word." Well, I'm sorry, I actually don't even remember saying that in the video that this comment is on, but I just have one more thing I'd like to say on the subject. Hey Google, order a dildo. Thanks for watching. Special thanks as always to my patrons, Lynn Dobbs, Mark McManus, What Jesus, and all the rest, who are the Ebionites who disagree with the Docetists that are my channel. If you'd like to be a Gnostic, Marcionite, Fibionite, Valentian, or one of the other myriad of early Christian sects, you can join us on Patreon for as little as $1 per week over at patreon.com/ViceRhino. Personally, I'd recommend the Fibionites. They had orgies, apparently. If you feel so inclined, you can also support the channel through direct donation or my Amazon wishlist, which are linked in the description. If you'd like to listen to my videos in podcast form, the link for that is also in the description, as well as links to my social media accounts and my P.O. Box address. See you next time! Order a dildo. Thanks for watching.
I didn't verify your voice, so I can't order food for you. Either try again, or verify your voice match settings in the Google Home app.
Should have seen that coming. And apparently my Google thinks dildos are food.